Hey, and welcome to week 8 of Signs and Symbols, Enhancing Science Instruction Through Literacy in the MCCS Era. This week is all about science and integration with MCCS, and you'll notice that we list the Montana Science Content Standards, which of course are adopted standards, and then list national science documents, and I'll take some time to explain that. But first, I actually want to do some course updates and information, and that's why I asked everyone to watch the video first. So we have some deadlines that are coming up. The resource sharing assignment is due this Friday, and on the YouTube station there is a specific little video you can watch about resource sharing. This is not a big, long assignment. Really and truly, the point of this assignment is for all of you to be able to hear from each other about some resources that are out there that you think would be helpful, and we formalized it so that we could award points and make it a real part of the course in that way, but please don't really stress out a ton about making this a super formal assignment. You do need to do it twice. It's 10 points for each of the 2 resources that you share. So we expect you to find 2 resources that support the theories we've been talking about and the inclusion of literacy, and then to tell your classmates about where to find them and how to use them. Final project part 1 is due this Friday. And there are some of you who have kind of already said that you're struggling with some things going on right now this week. If that applies to you, please contact us now to let us know when you think it will be done. Again, there's a video up that explains part 1, but basically part 1 is a pretty standard lit review type document where you are going through and explaining the theory that you've chosen for your final project. And it's the most important thing for you to know is that this is your opportunity to show us that you understand the theory. And then final project part 2 is due on August 22nd, which is 2 weeks away from the end of this week. If you have questions, let us know. August 22nd is a deadline that we set because that's the end of the course. The course will close. We do want to be able to award you your renewal units. So if you have any questions about that deadline or have any reasons you can anticipate now to struggle with that deadline, let us know. And again, there's that video online, but I just want to emphasize you don't have to write a new unit for this. You can pick something you've taught every year that's close and make some modifications to it. You can pick something you've taught every year that you really want to revamp, or you can start from scratch. That's up to you. We want this project to be an opportunity for you to kind of motivate yourself to get something ready for this school year that's coming up, which for some of you will have started on August 22nd or could potentially have as we have Montana schools starting around them. My last bullet here, we are working with the University of Montana in Missoula to get graduate credit set up for the fall. We don't anticipate any reason why that won't happen. We just don't have final confirmation yet. As long as our approval goes through for fall, we have a pathway set up so that those of you who completed the course this summer can get 2 graduate credits for your work this summer. Those aren't free credits. They're just like any other graduate credit where you pay the university a fee for those credits, but they are really useful for renewals. If you're working towards a master's, there's some limit to how many credits like that you can have, but every master's program accepts some of those. And if you're working on a master's through UM, it's even more clear. Georgia Cobbs, who's the dean for CNI, is very excited about this course, and so it's definitely something that we can work out in terms of your program. So if that applies to you, please contact us now so that we can make sure to get you set up for that, so that you wouldn't get your credits until the end of the fall semester, but we have permission to let people from this summer earn those credits this fall. A quick guide to this week. The required readings are really short. I recommend, though, that you pick one of the 3 optional articles. Because we have all those deadlines this week, I didn't want to give you a bunch of articles to look at. So those 3 optional articles are all things that were published in the NSTA journals, and they address one or more of the practices that we're going to talk about this week. And I just feel like depending on how you're structuring your final project, those articles might be really great resources. So I'd encourage you to look at them and see if any of them are things that you would want to use. The framework chapter is essential reading for every science teacher in Montana eventually. Some of you have already read it. Some of you really are excited to read it, but there's no way you're going to get through those 40 pages this week. Some of you will use the framework chapter as one of the readings that you cite in your final project. So just think a little bit about whether that applies to you. The framework chapter that I assigned is the chapter that goes over the practices, and the practices are the key tie into literacy in the framework and in the NGSS standards. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, and you'll see a little bit of that in the required readings. But if that's something that you think you're going to need, I wanted to make sure you knew where that was in the framework. And at some point, if you don't do it this week, I would recommend reading that chapter. As far as videos, the NGSS video is really short. NGSS is a difficult document. It has an architecture. So unless you have extensive practice with the NGSS, watch the video. It'll help you deal with the activities and stuff this week. The optional video is a fantastic thing to watch as you think about your final project. It's totally worth the 10 minutes. It goes through and shows an NGSS performance expectation, the Common Core standards, it outlines a unit, and it shows you clips from different parts of the unit as the teacher walks the students through the content, relying on these literacy practices that we've looked at. If you already have a great plan for your final project and you don't have the 10 minutes, I've made it optional, but it really is a great video in terms of thinking about that final project. And then the last thing, the activity that I've listed for this week, it might help you with your final project, but it'll definitely help you to better understand how you can use NGSS as a resource, even if you're teaching to our old standards. And again, I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew that my point in giving you that activity is to help you to think about what that might look like as you're doing your planning throughout the year, no matter what subject you're teaching in science, how you can use the NGSS website as a tool to help with your planning, even with the old standards. So that was 7 minutes of intro. This is going to be our longest video, I'm sure. I apologize in advance for that. So brief history. In 2006, we adopted our Montana Science Content Standards, and those are 4th grade and 8th grade and 12th grade benchmarks, or upon graduation benchmarks. And there are 6 different topics. The first one is a lot about planning investigations and inquiry and how we do science. The second one is physical science. The third is life science. The fourth is earth science, and then we have one about history and one about technology. We'll look at those in more detail later. Within each of those, there's kind of a handful of benchmarks that cover the range of topics that you would have there. In 2009, we published the essential learning expectations. There's a really big difference between adoption and publication. Adoption writes something into rule, and that then becomes what we use for assessment. It becomes what your district is responsible for aligning its curriculum to. Publication means people wanted more guidance, and so OPI wrote something, published it, and you're allowed to use it as a guide. You do not have to use it. You're not bound to it at all. And our assessment uses it only for reference, not as a requirement. In 2012, there was a publication of a framework for K-12 science education, and that's the framework that we're looking at a lot this week, and we're going to talk a lot more about that framework. And then also in 2012, the plans for NGSS were set forward, and Montana became a lead state for the writing of the next generation science standards. And that meant we had access to some confidential copies of things. We were able to have a team that traveled and learned at some national meetings. It also meant that we made a commitment at the time of our next adoption to at least seriously consider adopting NGSS as written. Our lead state team had a wide representation on it, and that team is to some degree still intact and working on different projects and kind of ready for that time when we might adopt new science standards to kind of be able to speak to the input that we had. And then in 2013, we saw the publication of the Next Generation Science Standards. That happened in April of 2013. Since the publication of the Next Generation, I'm going to pause before we talk more about the Next Generation Science Standards and the framework, and we're going to talk about Montana Science Content Standards, and I briefly named them a second ago. One of your assignments is to read just Standards 1, 5, and 6, I'm not asking you to read the content part of these, but I want you to look at 1, 5, and 6 because I think they are where we see some relevance to literacy. So standard 1 says that students through the inquiry process will demonstrate the ability to design, conduct, evaluate, and communicate the results and form reasonable conclusions of scientific investigations. So that one is really a lot about investigating, planning things, evaluating, all of that. Sometimes we see teachers have a unit at the beginning of the year that kind of covers standard 1 and then assumes that students will be able to implement that knowledge throughout the year as they move on to different content areas. Standard 5 says that students through the inquiry process understand how scientific knowledge and technological developments impact communities, cultures, and societies. So this really is about this idea of technological developments and their impact on us. There's definitely some ties back to Indian Education for All here, some ideas of the history of culture and how that's related to science. And then standard 6, students understand historical developments in science and technology, and that's really just about history. I single these out as separate because when we look at this transition to national documents, these 3 things are not treated as content any longer. Our standards from 2006 continue to treat these as content. These things are being tested independently on our current tests, but they are not treated as content anymore. But they are the things that you're reading today or this week so that you can be a little bit familiar with the places where this language about the inclusion of literacy might fit into our current standards. And just for reference, while we're talking about them, I mentioned that standard 2 is about physical science. It states that through that inquiry process, students will demonstrate knowledge of properties, forms, changes, and interactions of physical and chemical systems. And just to point that out, that physical science basic description remains consistent in the current national documents. Standard 3, students through the inquiry process demonstrate knowledge of characteristics, structures, and functional living things, the process and diversity of life, and how living organisms interact with each other and their environment. Life science, again, stays very consistent as a kind of big picture description in the new documents. And then standard 4, demonstrate a knowledge of composition, structures, processes, and interactions of Earth systems and other objects in space. This one is a little bit less consistent. We have some things added into Earth science in the new documents. The parts that are here are still in the new documents, but we kind of have an expansion in Standard 4. And if you're interested in knowing more about how our content standards, these 3 that I'm going to say are the content of science, relate to the next generation science standards or the framework, there definitely are opportunities to learn more about that through our office. Let me know if you're interested. So the next generation science standards, since April of 2013, we've seen adoption by 13 states or 12 states in the District of Columbia. As of July 9th, 2014, this slide is accurate with the adoption of New Jersey. I would say that there actually are some states that aren't pictured on this slide that have adopted. You can see those orange states are the ones that have adopted, and the blue states have some official step. Those blue states don't even include, there are at least 2 other states that I would say on this map have adopted NGSS, but they've done it without calling it NGSS. They've rewritten their own standards to include an exact mirror, essentially, of NGSS. They don't appear on these maps for political reasons, but I would definitely point out that there are 2 additional states who would count on this list. With the adoption, with the inclusion of New Jersey, 1 in 4 students in our country lives in and is taught in a state that has adopted NGSS. That has huge implications for textbooks. Especially we see huge implications for textbooks because of the adoption in California, which is one of the states that really defines textbook writing. And so we'll start to see our materials change regardless of what we choose to do here in Montana. Which leads us to this question of what has happened with NGSS since 2013. We're taking our time. We are definitely taking time to support the implementation of the Common Core state standards. Specifically, as science teachers, we're supporting that literacy piece, and we hope to sometime soon begin to provide some materials to science teachers about supporting the mathematics portion. In fall and winter of 2013, I spent a lot of time driving around. We had day-long meetings with 225 Montana educators in a list of cities. Many of the people who are taking this class participated in one of those meetings because they ended up on my listserv and therefore knew about the class. Since then, we're doing a verification round, which I need way more participation in than I have. It's all available online. There are credits available for participating. And it's really important that we have that verification round because we had a lot of kind of variety in responses during the initial analysis. So what's next for Montana was Science Standards initial analysis on the alignment supports the use of NGSS by individual teachers, schools, or districts based on decisions by local school boards. In general, NGSS meets and exceeds our 2006 standards. Exceptions to that will be noted in the final document. Those exceptions are things like NGSS doesn't state the requirement to use metric units. However, if I'm going to use most science formulas, if I have a measurement that's not in metric units, my formula is probably not going to work very well. And so it's definitely an implied statement. Also, NGSS doesn't have specific statements about safety. Again, it's very much implied that every school would be in compliance with OSHA standards for safety, which in many ways cover the same materials that the safety sections of our prior curriculums did. You'll notice that I read that exactly as written. It's a very important statement. If you, as a teacher, a school, or a district are interested in using NGSS, your first step is to talk to your administration and get support from your local school board. If your local school board is willing to allow you to organize and align your curriculum using NGSS, the state has no reason why you can't do that. No decisions have been made and no timeline has been set for decisions been made, and I just want to be really clear that OPI doesn't adopt standards. The Board of Public Education does. The Superintendent Juneau, makes a recommendation to them, and then they make that adoption. And if you're interested in learning more about that, the Board of Public Education does have a website and their contact information is public. So let's do a quick overview of the framework. I know a lot of people are very familiar with the framework, so I don't really want to bore you. But I want to make sure that we cover this, and I gave you the link in this week's assignment page to download the full PDF of the framework. You also can purchase copies. Your school may be willing to purchase a copy for every teacher in the building, given that this is really a vital reference for all science teachers to have. The framework states very explicitly that science is composed of 3 dimensions and that those 3 dimensions are of equal importance. The 3 dimensions are disciplinary core ideas, which is equivalent to our current use of the term content. Those are all of the what of science that we expect students to learn. The science and engineering practices, which is the how do scientists do their work. And cross-cutting concepts, which are those things that are so vital to understanding in science that we rely on them nearly every time we come to understand new disciplinary core ideas, things like patterns and cause and effect. There's not much that I can talk about in science that isn't going to heavily rely on those cross-cutting concepts. We're going to focus a lot more on one of these than the other 2, but I want to make sure that we understand the basic premise of these. And I love this illustration for showing this idea that they should be braided together, that we're never alone teaching a practice. We're never alone teaching a core idea. We're never alone teaching a cross-cutting concept. That at any given time, whenever we're doing anything in science, we should be relying on all 3 of those things. They should be constantly braided together. And the structure of the NGSS, when you watch that video about how to read NGSS, you'll see they've actually developed the standards so that we can say that in assessment, students would need to demonstrate competence at integrating all 3, which definitely leads to the idea that our instruction should be integrated. And really what we're saying when we say that is that student performance is completely supported on all sides by all three of these. If we were to take away any part of this, we'd be missing a piece of the picture. We really can't do that in our instruction. We have to support our student performance on all sides. I want to just pull back before we dive in, and we're going to dive into the practices specifically in a minute. And I want to cover these 6 principles of the framework. Some are more important than others. These are the 6 stated principles of the framework. But I really want to emphasize that as they wrote the document, they were focused on the idea that children are born investigators. They were focused on the idea that you have to go to the basics and the core, that students have to know how science is done, and that there are just limited ideas that they have to know, and that there's a lot more kind of choice about what's important to surround those core ideas with than maybe our previous standards with their lists of vocabulary terms have allowed for. Another principle is that understanding develops over time, and that we're not going to cycle back through in the same kind of spiral way we've done in the past, but instead we really need to be able to see a progression from what we're talking about in the early grades to what we're talking about in the later grades, and that all of that has a continuous progression and supports each other. And then science and engineering require both knowledge and practice. And again, we've talked so much about how the practice of science and the practice of engineering really relies on literacy. So this is one of the key places that we pull that literacy in. Connecting to students' interests and experiences is vital. We're not going to get students engaged without doing that. And we've talked a lot about how literacy can be a major factor in connecting to that. And then again, that we need to promote equity in science. And I could talk a lot more about that, but that would be a whole other webinar. They've done a great job promoting equity within the standards documents themselves. So we're going to focus today on the practices, and I'm not going to go through all of these practices now. We're going to go through them more in the later parts. If you're not at all familiar with the practices, I recommend you pause and read through these so that you're at least familiar with what the 8 practices are. One of your reading assignments today is an explanation of this chart, or a version of this chart. They're all kind of based on each other. There are a couple of versions out there. This shows us the math practices, the science and engineering practices, and the student performance descriptors. And I might have gotten the name of that wrong, but from the ELA standards, there's some statements about what students can do if they are going to be proficient. You'll see that there's a lot of overlap, and that in the middle we have this overlap about reading, writing, and speaking grounding in evidence, constructing viable arguments, engaging in arguments from evidence, and using content-rich text to build that knowledge. We see this really integrated picture that requires a lot of reading and writing and some very deliberate types of writing in science. And we've, in a lot of ways, this course has been built around supporting this interaction here. We're going to talk a little bit more today, actually, though, about how important this overlap here is, this obtain, evaluate, and communicate information, which aligns nicely with an English statement as well. So if we take practice number 8 and we really look at it closely and we think about it in terms of the bigger picture of how we go through and we do things in science, we're kind of always going through the practice of obtaining information, which we might call gathering evidence, evaluating information, which we might relate to constructing an explanation. I've already got my evidence, I'm evaluating it to make this explanation. And then communicating information, which would be communicating my reasoning. And we could take that last practice then and organize all the other practices, which, you know, we might develop or use a model in multiple places here. But we could think of all of the practices individually as a piece of doing one of these 3 things that comes from that last practice. So now that we can think about this big picture idea of how practice 8 allows us to really think that we're organizing and using all the practices, I want to kind of go through in each practice and show you a list of some things that, some student actions, some student abilities that relate to the practice, and really highlight the use of literacy, either in the form of reading or writing or speaking and listening. So I'm actually going to go through the slides and I'm going to sit on each slide just for 10 seconds. So pause it, look at the text, and then move on. You can see here that statement at the top, in addition to all the others. When we obtain, evaluate, and communicate information, we're doing all of the other things. And in addition to that, we still have 4 new statements. The practices are such a huge integration with reading and writing and speaking and listening and literacy. And that's why NGSS aligns the Common Core ELA standards through the practices. And that's why these practices are so important and why this course was built around this idea of what scientists really do. That's why we started there. Because when we think about the practice of doing science, of being a scientist, of engaging in science, we have to read and write. Every single one of these relies on that. Thanks for being patient with the really long video, and I look forward to seeing all of your assignments. And again, please contact us if you have questions.